This is my first video update coming to you from Athens, Greece on this Thursday. And I am at the Church of Elias here in downtown Athens, in central Athens. And this is a really big church here. And it's a nice church, beautiful church. And I thought I would come here and do a video. And let's talk about Merkel. Let's talk about Angela Merkel and the statements that she made on Wednesday for an article that was published on Wednesday on Zeit magazine. And before we get into what Merkel said, which is very revealing, let's segue into this story. let's do a nice proper segue by talking a little bit about the comments that Russian President Vladimir Putin made yesterday when he was speaking to the Council for Civil Society and Human Rights. Now, I talked about this briefly in my evening video yesterday, but I think that this is a nice segue into Merkel's comments. And what Vladimir Putin, what he told this meeting of human rights, civil society and human rights, is connected to Merkel's revelation with regards to the Minsk Accords, Minsk I and Minsk II. And Putin was asked about the duration of this special military operation, as Russia calls it, this conflict, this war, this invasion, however you want to label what is going on in Ukraine. And when he was asked about the duration of the conflict, Putin said this, and I quote, "Of course, this might be a lengthy process." But then Putin also said that this conflict really began in 2014 when the US backed a nationalist coup in Kiev. Putin explained that Moscow had little choice but to intervene in February to defend the Donbas republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, which have since voted to join Russia along with most of Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. Quote, "These new territories are a major gain for Russia," Putin said. "Even Peter the Great sought access to the Azov Sea, and it is now an internal sea of the Russian Federation. Most importantly, the people who live there showed in a referendum that they want to be in Russia and feel themselves part of our world. They are now with us, millions of them, and that is the greatest outcome." So this is a really interesting statement from the Russian president. On the one hand, it prepares the people of Russia for what lies ahead. And Putin says this might be a lengthy process. So he's letting everybody know that look, we're going to stick to our goals of the special military operation. And these goals are going to be completed. And this might take some time. So that's the first thing that he says in this statement. But he also says, look, this is what lies ahead may take some time, but let's not forget that this conflict is already a lengthy conflict, because this didn't start on February 24th, 2022 with the announcement of the special military operation. This started in 2014 with the Maidan coup, the nationalist coup in Kiev. And that's a good segue for what Merkel said in her interview with Zeit magazine. The fact that Putin, on the very same day that this interview from Merkel comes out, the fact that Putin in a statement references the fact that this conflict in Ukraine did not start in February 2022, but in 2014 with the Maidan coup, is an interesting coincidence. But the revelation that Merkel gives us with regards to the Maidan coup and Minsk I and Minsk II, it kind of proves the point that Putin is making in his statements during this meeting, which is that this war is already a lengthy war. So we've already been at this for 8-9 years. This is what Putin's saying. We've already been at this for 8-9 years. Let's see it through to the end. We have to see it through now to the end. That is what he is saying. We have to take this to its conclusion. And I think during this statement, Putin actually said that Russia is achieving their goals, and they are going to achieve their goals and win. But the fact that he says this started in 2014, we're going to now take this to the end, is very much coincides with what Merkel said to Zeit magazine. And here is what Merkel said in this interview. Merkel told the Zeit magazine her policy towards Russia and Ukraine was correct, even if not successful. Quote, I thought the initiation of NATO accession for Ukraine and Georgia discussed in 2008 to be wrong, Merkel said. The countries neither had the necessary prerequisites for this, nor had the consequences of such a decision been fully considered, both with regard to Russia's actions against Georgia and Ukraine and to NATO and its rules of assistance. Merkel described the September 2014 Minsk agreement as an attempt to give Ukraine time. That is a direct quote, an attempt to give Ukraine time. France and Germany had brokered a ceasefire after the failure of Ukraine's attempt to subdue the republics of Donetsk and Lugansk by force. Ukraine used this time to get stronger, as you can see today. Merkel continued, the Ukraine of 2014-15 is not the Ukraine of today, as you saw in the Battle of Debaltsevo in early 2015. Russian President Vladimir Putin could easily have overrun them at the time, and I very much doubt that the NATO countries could have done as much then as they do now to help Ukraine. The defeat at Debaltsevo resulted in the Second Minsk Protocol being signed in February 2015. Merkel said that it was clear to all of us that the conflict was frozen, that the problem had not been solved, but that gave Ukraine valuable time. Meanwhile, she defended the decision to build Nord Stream 2 pipeline for Russian gas, since refusing to do so would have had dangerously worsened the climate with Moscow given the situation in Ukraine. It just so happened that Germany couldn't get gas elsewhere, she added. Asked for any self-criticism, Merkel told Zeit that the Cold War never really ended because Russia was basically not at peace, and that NATO should have reacted more quickly to Russia's aggressiveness in 2014. So much here to discuss. So, this is an admission from Angela Merkel that, at least this is the way I read it, this is an admission from Angela Merkel that the conflict in Ukraine, the special military operation, started on February 24th, 2022, was not the beginning, but was just merely a continuation of what took place in 2014. And Merkel says in this interview that everything that took place, everything that was brokered in 2014, Minsk I, Minsk II, all of it was designed, engineered to give Ukraine more time. More time for what? More time to prepare for an eventual smash with Russia. Remember a month and a half ago, I was in Cyprus at the time, when Putin was also giving a speech, or he was in a meeting, and he made the statement, Ukraine is being used and has been used as a battering ram to try and and destroy the Russian Federation, he used the word battering ram. This is what Putin was referring to, and this is what Merkel is admitting to. From 2014 up to today, the plan was always about using Ukraine as a battering ram to destroy Russia. That's why the Obama White House, with Vice President Joe Biden, and the European Union, with guys like Poland's then Foreign Minister Sikorski, that's why all of these guys, McCain, that's why they all took such an interest in the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. And that is why they initiated this coup in Ukraine in 2014 and the subsequent war with Donbass afterwards, is because the goal was always about using Ukraine to lead to the destruction, the balkanization of the Russian Federation. That is what Merkel is saying. The Minsk agreement was an attempt to give Ukraine time. Her words, her quote. And then she reveals that Ukraine used this time to get stronger, as you can see today. The Ukraine of 2014 is not the Ukraine of today. This is Merkel's admission that, look, we got this coup in 2014. We engineered this coup. And we thought we were going to be able to get all of Ukraine. And what does all of Ukraine mean? It means all of it, Donbass, but also Crimea. You see, the collective West, they have never forgiven Putin for taking Crimea, for having Crimea ascend into Russia. I had to think about the words there for a second. That's why I paused, because the collective West says annexing Crimea. I see it as giving Crimea the opportunity to ascend into the Russian Federation. And keep in mind that Putin engineered what happened in Crimea. He stepped in to the Crimea situation at a time when we knew that these nationalist forces were, these coup forces, they were sending nationalist groups from the West into Crimea to subdue the population in much the same way that they did in Mariupol and Kharkov and Odessa. You know, the plan was, look, we get the coup, we overthrow the government, but then we have to get these nationalist thugs, these nationalist groups, to take over cities like Odessa, like Kharkiv, like Mariupol, cities which are historically Russian and have a Russian feeling to them. We have to get these Western forces into these cities so that we can prevent these cities from going against this coup that we engineered. And that's what they were doing in Crimea. They had these Western forces, these Western groups moving towards Crimea, and it was actually the Crimean authorities that stopped them. They paused them from actually entering into Crimea, and that gave Putin the time to get Crimea in order, so that he could get the vote and have Crimea ascend into the Russian Federation without any loss of life. So there was a lot that went down in Crimea, but they did try. They did try to get Crimea so that it could move into the camp of the coup forces, but they didn't succeed. So Putin was always one step ahead of them with regards to Crimea. Unfortunately, he couldn't do the same with Odessa and Kharkov and other historic Russian cities. But then you had the Donbass, the people of Donbass. They said, we don't want anything to do with this coup government, and we got the war. And Merkel is saying here that look, we got the coup, but we couldn't get all of Ukraine, and so we ended up in a situation where we had a conflict. And in that conflict, Donbass won. And there was a time in that conflict where the Donbass militia, they had the Ukraine military surrounded in an area known as the BITCHUTE. And they had created this cauldron, and they were about to annihilate the Ukraine military that was trapped in this cauldron in the BITCHUTE. And I remember when I was reporting on this story at the time, that there were reports that this wasn't only Ukraine forces trapped in the BITCHUTE, but there were hundreds, if not thousands, of NATO forces that were trapped in the BITCHUTE. Now, this freaked Merkel out because she realized that two bad things were going to happen. The first thing is that the coup that they had engineered and that had now led to this conflict was about to crumble. As the military was going to crumble, so was all the work and effort and investment that they put into the coup that was going to crumble and fall apart. And you were about to get hundreds, maybe thousands, but I've heard hundreds of NATO troops, mercenaries, NATO soldiers, fighting under the guise of the Ukraine military. They were about to get annihilated in the BITCHUTE. That's what was going to happen. And she called up Putin, and she was like, look, we need to get a ceasefire right away. And Putin agreed. And they got the Minsk Accords. Actually, I think in this case, the Minsk II Accords. And that was what froze the conflict. But you see, Merkel and the collective West, Merkel and France, actually, at the time, I think it was Hollande that was brokering the deal. Maybe, I'm trying to think, did Hollande was Minsk 1, and I think it was Hollande for Minsk 2, or maybe Macron was then in office, and he was part of Minsk 2. But anyway, it was Germany and France that said, look, we need a ceasefire. We need to prevent the collapse of the Ukraine government, this coup government that we've put in place, and we have to save our NATO forces that are trapped, the Ukraine military and the NATO forces that allegedly were trapped in this cauldron. And they got Minsk, and they got the ceasefire. But Merkel admits here in her statement to Zeit magazine that she was lying. She was duping the Russian president because their intention was never to enforce Minsk. They then went on to Plan B. They couldn't get Plan A, which was seizing all of Ukraine, especially grabbing Crimea. That was the big prize. They couldn't get Plan A. They couldn't get Plan B either, which was to win the war against the Donbass. So that was probably Plan B, to start the war with Donbass and at least win Donbass in the conflict. They were about to lose there, and so then they went to Plan C, which was Merkel, France, Hollande, Macron, talk to Putin, dupe him, lie to him, convince him so that you could freeze this conflict. And then let's move on to building up the Ukraine military. And so we can revisit the Ukraine battering ram somewhere down the line in the future. And lo and behold, which U.S. president comes into office so that the Ukraine battering ram can resurface? Joe Bidenomitis, the vice president of Obama during the first conflict of Ukraine, during the coup d'etat in 2014. You get a 4-year break with Trump. Trump doesn't like NATO. He doesn't like Zelensky. He wants none of this nonsense. A pause in the tension in Ukraine, though Trump did send lethal weapons to Ukraine. There was a general thawing out, a general pause, and then you get Bidenomitis. And what do you get? You get renewed tension, and you get this renewed drive to kickstart this battering ram and to goad Russia into this conflict. That is exactly what Merkel is admitting to. She duped the Russian president. Because Putin believed that the Germans and the French would push Ukraine, the government of Poroshenko at the time, and then Zelensky, they would push Ukraine to enforce the Minsk Accords. And they didn't do such a thing. Instead, what they were actually doing was building up Ukraine and preparing Ukraine, Merkel's words, preparing Ukraine for a time when Ukraine would be ready to be used as a battering ram to destroy the Russian Federation. That is what Merkel has admitted to in this statement. So that brings us to where we are today, and that is Merkel's admission. She was BSing Putin. You could say that Putin fell for it. You can say that Putin thought she was an honest actor. Putin had a meeting with the mothers of the soldiers a couple of weeks ago, and he even admitted in his own way, he said, look, we should have probably overrun the Ukraine military back in 2014, but we didn't. We chose a path of negotiation and ceasefire. He admitted to that. To be fair to Putin and Russia, we don't know at what state, at what level the Russian government and the Russian economy was at during that time, and perhaps Putin and his team, they understood that, look, if we overrun the Ukraine military, maybe the collective West, they'll implement some sort of shock and awe sanctions against us. They were already rolling out sanctions because of Crimea, but perhaps they thought, look, we're not ready for a big onslaught of sanctions just yet. So perhaps the best route is to put our faith, our trust in our partners, as Russia called them at the time, our partners in the West, and hopefully they'll abide by Minsk I and Minsk II. But that didn't work out. So maybe, Russia and Putin's team at the time also, they weighed everything out and they said, look, overrunning the Ukraine military is not in our benefit at the moment because we're also not ready. In much the same way that Merkel said Ukraine needed time to get ready to be used as a battering ram, perhaps Putin said, look, we're not ready, and let's take a gamble on Merkel's, not only her word, but a signed document as well, because they got a signed document that was approved by the United Nations as well, by the Security Council as well. And everyone went back on their word. So, Russia got duped during NATO expansion in the Reagan and Bush years, where they said, Baker said, we're not going to move further east. Clinton moved further east. George W. moved further east. They got duped by Minsk I and Minsk II. Merkel now is coming out and just saying it flat out. We lied to you guys. We conned you. That's what we did. That's what has brought us to where we are today. Even Maria Zakharova, she came out with a statement saying as much. She said that Merkel's comments prove Minsk deal deception. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel has confirmed her government's duplicity regarding the conflict in Ukraine by confirming that the 2014 ceasefire agreement was meant to give Kiev time to build up its military. That's the statement from Maria Zakharova. Anyway, that is the revelations from Angela Merkel. Incredible revelations. And let's press on. Let's press on and do a couple of quick stories here, and we'll wrap this all up with the clown world. And we are getting reports that Russia is finalizing their preparations for a response to the price ceiling that the G7 and the EU has imposed on Russian oil. So Russia's preparing their answer to that. And that's going to be interesting to watch. We have this oil tanker jam, this blockade that has happened in Turkey. So we're starting to see, in the early days of this price cap, we're already starting to see all kinds of chaos with regards to tanker movement, oil tanker movement. And in this instance, according to Bloomberg, we have an oil tanker jam in Turkey. And 26 oil tankers are now stuck off the coast of Turkey as the Erdogan government is demanding clarification of their insurance status. Tankers carrying more than 23 million barrels of oil cannot pass through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. At the same time, about 10 tankers are related to Kazakhstan. This was stated by the head of the Kazmunai Gas Company. US and UK officials are pushing Turkey to reconsider the insurance requirements, given the shipment from Kazakhstan are not subject to sanctions. Yeah, Erdogan is effing around with the European Union and the collective West, and he's asking all these tankers, of which I've heard reports that only one tanker is carrying Russian oil. Only one tanker. All the other tankers are carrying Kazakh oil and Kazakh tankers and oil from elsewhere. But Erdogan's like, look, I want to see all your insurance documents, because we now have all of this red tape and paperwork thanks to the EU G7 sanctions. So you have this big blockade of tankers now in Turkey, and this is just the beginning of this this screw up from the EU and the G7 with regards to this oil price cap. What else do we have going on? I think that's it. No. We have a couple of more stories. Newsweek is running with a headline saying that Ukraine's national grid could collapse by Christmas. You have Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev. He is also warning citizens of Kiev that things are looking very, very bad with regards to the electric energy situation in Kiev. He is actually saying that things may become apocalyptic. It may be an apocalyptic winter, according to Mayor Vitaly Klitschko. Quote, Kiev might lose power, water, and heat supply. The apocalypse might happen, like in Hollywood films, when it's not possible to live in homes considering the low temperatures, Klitschko said. But we are fighting and doing everything we can to make sure that this does not happen. So that is what Klitschko said as he's warning citizens of Kiev, and even Zelensky himself, the Time Person of the Year. He said that Ukraine is unable to fully restore the national energy system, which has been degraded by Russian missile strikes. And he's urging his citizens to cope with the situation. Ukrainians should not forget that it is now impossible to restore 100% of the energy system as it was before. We need time. This is why shutdown schedules remain in most cities and regions, Zelensky said. So the preparation of the Ukrainian people for an electric grid collapse. That is what is happening. That is what awaits. And I'm getting reports on the ground that the Ukraine military continues to throw soldiers at Bakhmut, and the Russians are just kind of just letting these soldiers come in, and they're grinding them down. They're annihilating all of these forces that continue to come into Bakhmut, and it's almost like this is it's like this is what Russia wanted. I mean, they're not as much concerned with pressing forward in the offensive territory-wise with Bakhmut. They're just kind of sitting back there and saying, okay, keep on sending soldiers, Zelensky, to Bakhmut, and we'll just continue to grind them down, because this is one of the main goals of our SMO, which is the demilitarization. It just seems like the Ukraine military is playing right into the hands of the Russian military in Bakhmut. And we're also getting reports of a lot of movement happening in Belarus. A lot of movement, not only from the Russian side, but from the Ukrainian side. It looks like the Ukraine military, on the orders of NATO, they're moving reinforcements along the border with Belarus. Some of their last remaining best fighting forces are now being moved in the direction of Belarus, because they feel that something is going to be coming from the direction of Belarus. And we're getting reports that the Russian and Belarus military are making moves in that direction. So Is something going to happen there? Hard to say, but Lukashenko did come out with a statement the other day, and he did say that the Russian and the Belarus military are now effectively one. They are one military. The SBU says that the Russians are preparing to strike now at telecommunications data centers and the backbone communication lines, IT companies and offices of internet providers. That's also a statement coming from the SBU. They are afraid that the missile strikes now are going to broaden and they're going to move past the electric grid. Not good news for Kiev and in Poland. And in Poland, the media is now starting to report the death of Polish mercenaries on the front lines in Ukraine. This is inevitable. The more Poland gets involved in Ukraine, the more they send mercenaries or NATO forces to fight alongside the Ukrainian military on the front lines, the more you are going to get Polish nationals killed in this conflict, and you're not going to be able to cover it up much longer. The more Polish soldiers perish, the more difficult it's going to get for the Polish government to cover things up. And it's just natural that you're going to have people in Poland saying, I knew a guy that was fighting in Ukraine and he got injured or he died, and then someone else is going to say, well, that's interesting. I also have a friend or a family member or a friend of a friend, or I heard someone telling me that they have a friend who's in Ukraine. And this is not going to be easily covered up the more Poland gets involved. So I thought that was also a very interesting development. So time is definitely on Russia's side in all aspects, whether you're looking at the electric grid, the missile strikes, NATO or EU member involvement in Ukraine, winter, mobilization. Putin said yesterday that 150,000 troops are already in the theater of operations, with 77,000 on the front lines, and the rest are in secondary roles. You already have the mobilization kicking in. You have reports of a lot more equipment that the Russians are sending to the front line, more tanks and more equipment and artillery. And so time is on Russia's side. Putin says it's going to be a lengthy process, and I'm going to wrap things up with something that I have been saying for a while now with regards to this conflict, which seems kind of strange when you at first think about it, but after a while it makes sense. And that is, the more time this conflict takes, the slower the Russians go, the faster the collective West, and especially the EU, crumble. That is exactly what is going on. The slower it takes for Russia to do what they need to do, the faster the EU crumbles. And you can see it in the oil price cap. You can see it in the coup that took place in Germany, this rinky-dink coup. That's what I'm calling it, a rinky-dink coup. But all jokes aside, this is a sign that the German government is in panic mode. And they're going to definitely use this rinky-dink coup to clamp down on the rights of German citizens, because what do they fear? They fear protests. They fear that people are going to get out onto the streets because the situation in Germany is crumbling. You can see this in a 9th EU sanctions package, where the EU is now desperate to figure out ways to continue to sanction Russia because they have no reverse gear. And so now they're going to sanction mining companies and media companies and drone companies and God knows what else. But I mean, they're running out of entities to sanction at this point in time. And you also see it, and I'm going to end it here, you also see the crumbling of the collective West. The slower this goes, you can see the crumbling of the collective West in this interesting article, which is that Western airlines need to return to Russian airspace according to IATA, which is the airline organization, the airline association. I think it goes by IATA, I think is how you would pronounce it, but I'll say the International Air Transport Association, IATA. Anyway, they are also saying enough. They're saying that we need Russian airspace. Airline companies are in the collective West are struggling now that China is coming back online. Now that China is starting to emerge from the zero COVID policy, and they're going to start traveling. The IATA is saying that the airspace in Europe is just too crowded. It's getting dangerous. Bad things are going to happen, and airline companies are suffering. We should be looking to reopen Russian airspace, to have it accessible to all airlines to transit through the traditional Siberian overflights so that Europe can access Asia in the most efficient way, Willie Walsh told a press briefing in Geneva. If you look at the closure of Ukrainian airspace and Russian airspace in other parts of the world, the amount of traffic that's flowing through Europe has increased over certain routes, and that's not sustainable. This is what the IATA representative is saying. He is saying things are getting crowded, things are getting dangerous, airline companies are suffering. We need Russian airspace. We need to get back to normal. And now that China is going to be kickstarting things, and they're going to be starting to fly around the world, well, things are just going to get worse. So the slower this conflict grinds on, the faster the collective West, and especially the European Union, disintegrates. Walsh expects China to ease their policies over the coming year, which would allow more people to travel. This in turn would give Chinese airlines an advantage over European rivals whose flights are currently plagued by delays as they avoid Russian airspace. As we see China relax restrictions and reopen, then the issue of access through Russian airspace becomes a bigger question for the European carriers, particularly if it remains open for Chinese carriers to fly to Europe. A win for the Chinese carriers. More people flying around the globe. Europe getting more congested. Something bad is going to happen because of this stupid policy that Van der Crazy put in place to close airspace to Russian carriers. Something very bad is going to happen, and God forbid it does. I really hope nothing bad happens, God forbid. But this was just a very dumb idea from the European Union. This was the first action they took back in February. It was a very stupid action to close the airspace. Anyway, let's do a clown world. Do I have a clown world? Or has this whole video been a type of clown world? Even Tucker Carlson. Let me play two videos. Here's my clown world. Two videos to end it. The first video is Tucker Carlson even coming to the revelation that Ukraine is being used to goad Russia into conflict. This is what Tucker said on his show yesterday. So let me put that up right now. So even Tucker Carlson is saying, you know what? This war is really not about democracy and Ukraine and human rights and all of this nonsense. This war is about Ukraine being used to goad Russia into a conflict. So let me play that. And then I will play a video, or let me come back. Let me play that, and I'll be back.
It seems pretty clear that the Biden administration baited Russia into this invasion. You had the Vice President of the United States in Western Europe days before telling Zelensky to join NATO, which of course they knew was a red line. They wanted this invasion. That's my view. I think it's very obvious. You think this was all about preparing for a war with Russia?
If you think that Russia is a grave enemy of the United States, then it makes sense to try and lure them into a war that they can't win, like we got lured into one with Afghanistan for 20 years, or we lured the Soviet Union into a war with Afghanistan back in the 70s, because it does deplete your enemy. The question is, why should Russia be seen as our enemy? Both Obama and Trump said there's no reason to see Russia that way. It has 1/15 the size of our military budget. It's not threatening American borders. Why are we so obsessed with spending tens of millions of dollars to weaken Russia, which we could be using here at home to benefit the lives of American citizens, when Russia's not doing anything to the United States, unless you're a crazy resistance person who believes they're the reason Donald Trump won? But if you don't believe that, what is the rationale for this? There is none.
I know. And as usual, they've hijacked the best instincts of Americans, their compassion, and turn that against them.
I don't think that's a clown world, but I think that that revelation from Tucker Carlson plays really nicely into the narrative of today's video. And here's my clown world. I'm going to leave it with Joe Biden and this speech that he gave. And he was talking about, I think this was in Arizona, in Phoenix, if I'm not mistaken. And he was talking about nanos and no-nos and nano chips and no-no chips. And he just got completely confused and all twisted up. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with this video from Joe Biden. This is the Clown World, theduran.locals.com. We are also on Rockfin as well. And go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code Good Day. Coming to you from Elias Church in Greece. Take care.
We'll construct a second fab here in Phoenix to build chips, the 3 nano chips, the 3 nano chips that are 3 nano. And you know what I'm saying. Nano, no, I don't know.